There are deaths that make sense, accidents, illnesses, violence that leaves evidence, and then there are deaths like this one. Picture this: a beach at dawn, the kind of morning where the ocean meets the sky in shades of pearl and grey. The sand is cool beneath your feet, the waves whisper against the shore, and there, propped against the seawall, legs extended, feet crossed, is a man in a suit. He looks like he could be sleeping, but he's not. He's been dead for hours, and absolutely nothing about his death makes sense. Not the way he died, not who he was, not why he was there, not the cryptic message found in his pocket, torn from a book of Persian poetry, bearing two words that would become synonymous with mystery itself: Tamám Shud. It is finished, but this story was just beginning. Prologue. The man who wasn't there. December 1st, 1948. Adelaide, Australia. The war has been over for 3 years. The world is trying to rebuild, to move forward, to forget the darkness of the previous decade. But some darkness doesn't fade. Some mysteries arrive without warning, carrying secrets that will outlast everyone who tries to solve them. Somerton Beach is a pleasant stretch of coastline on the western edge of Adelaide, South Australia. It's the kind of place where families picnic on summer afternoons, where couples walk hand in hand as the sun sets over the water, respectable, peaceful, unremarkable. Until the morning of December 1st, 1948, when it became the setting for what would become Australia's most enduring mystery. At 6:30 a.m., police received a call. A body had been discovered on the beach by 2 early morning horseback riders. The man was lying in the sand near the crippled children's home, which sat on the corner of the Esplanade and Bickford Terrace. His back was propped against the sea wall, his legs were extended straight out in front of him, his feet were crossed at the ankles, neat, composed, almost deliberate. He was dressed entirely too formally for the beach. A dark suit, well tailored, a white shirt, a tie with American-style stripes, polished shoes that shone in the early morning light, an unlit cigarette tucked behind his right ear, another cigarette, more than half smoked, resting on the collar of his coat as if it had simply fallen there when he'd slumped back. The police who arrived on scene initially assumed they were dealing with a drunk who'd passed out and died of exposure during the night. It happened sometimes. People drank too much, found a quiet spot to sleep it off, and never woke up. But something about this felt different. The man's clothes were clean, expensive, well maintained. His shoes showed no signs of wear. His hands were uncalloused, not the hands of a laborer. Everything about him suggested someone of means, someone who took care of himself, someone who had no business dying anonymously on a beach. And then there was his expression. The officers who documented the scene noted that his face held an odd serenity, not the grimace of pain or the slack emptiness of sudden death, but something almost peaceful, as if he'd simply decided to lie back against the seawall and drift away. Within hours, the case would begin revealing details that defied explanation. Within days, it would become clear that this was no ordinary death, and within months, the Somerton Man, as he would come to be known, would become a fixture of Australian folklore, a mystery that would haunt investigators for 74 years. Because here's what made this case extraordinary. Despite every effort of modern police work, despite extensive investigations, despite the discovery of multiple clues that should have led to answers, no one could determine three fundamental things: who he was, why he died, or what brought him to that beach on that particular night. The Somerton Man had no identification. The labels had been carefully cut from every piece of his clothing. He carried nothing that could reveal his name: no wallet, no papers, no passport. Nothing except a collection of ordinary items that told investigators absolutely nothing about who he was or where he came from. And when pathologists performed an autopsy, they discovered something even more disturbing. They couldn't determine how he died. There were no injuries, no signs of violence, no obvious cause of death. His organs showed unusual symptoms that suggested poisoning, but every test came back negative. Whatever killed him had left no chemical signature, no trace, no evidence. It was as if he'd simply stopped living by force of will alone. But the strangest detail, the clue that would give this case its other name, wouldn't be discovered until 4 months later, when a pathologist performing a routine re-examination of the body's clothing made an extraordinary find. Hidden in a secret pocket sewn into the waistband of the man's trousers, so small and deep that it had been overlooked during the initial search, was a tiny rolled-up scrap of paper. Printed on it in ornate typeface were 2 words: Tamám Shud, Persian for "it is ended" or "it is finished." The words came from the final page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a collection of 12th century Persian poetry that had become wildly popular in the English-speaking world thanks to Edward Fitzgerald's romantic 1859 translation. Someone had torn this phrase from the last page of a book. Someone had carefully concealed it in a hidden pocket, and someone, presumably, had done this for a reason. But what reason? And who? The discovery of this scrap of paper transformed the case from a simple unexplained death into something far more complex. Because if the paper had been torn from a book, that book had to exist somewhere, and whoever possessed that book might hold the key to everything. The police launched a public appeal. Did anyone have a copy of the Rubaiyat with its final page torn out? For 8 months they waited. And then, in July 1949, a man walked into the Adelaide detective office with a story that would crack the case wide open, while simultaneously making it infinitely stranger. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the Somerton Man, we must start at the beginning. We must follow the investigation as it unfolded, clue by impossible clue, question by unanswerable question, until we arrive at the place where this story currently rests. 77 years later, with a name finally attached to the body, but with every other question remaining as mysterious as the day that man died on Somerton Beach. This is the story of the Tamám Shud Case, the mystery that ended before it began. Part 1. The Death. November the 30th, December 1st, 1948. Let's start with what we know for certain, because in this case, certainty is a rare commodity. On the evening of November 30th, 1948, the night before the body was discovered, several witnesses saw a man matching the Somerton man's description on or near the beach. At approximately 7 p.m., John Bain Lyons, a local jeweler, and his wife were taking their evening stroll along Somerton Beach. The weather was pleasant for late November, and Australian summer was beginning, bringing warm evenings and gentle ocean breezes. As they walked toward the suburb of Glenelg, the Lyons noticed a well-dressed man lying on the sand about 60 feet away, his back propped against the seawall. The man's legs were extended straight out, his feet crossed. He wore a suit, unusual attire for the beach, but not unheard of. Perhaps he was resting after work, enjoying the sunset before heading home. As they watched, the man raised his right arm upward, fully extended, then let it drop limply back to the sand. Mrs. Lyons commented to her husband that the gesture seemed odd, as if the man was trying to smoke a cigarette but couldn't quite manage it. They assumed he was drunk, perhaps sleeping off a heavy drinking session. It wasn't their business to interfere. They continued their walk and thought nothing more of it. About 30 minutes later, between 7:30 and 8 p.m., another couple passed by the same area. They noticed the man still lying in the same position, apparently motionless. Looking down at him from the path above, they could see he was smartly dressed. The suit, the polished shoes, everything neat and proper despite the beach setting. He wasn't moving, but they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. People fell asleep on beaches all the time. They kept walking. These would be the last confirmed sightings of the Somerton man alive, or at least the last sightings where anyone could later identify him with certainty. But there was one more witness, one more person who saw something that night, though their account would only emerge later in the investigation. Someone reported seeing a man looking down at the sleeping figure from the top of the steps that led down to the beach, just standing there, watching. For how long, the witness couldn't say. And who that observer was and why they were watching would remain another unanswered question in a case full of them. Sometime between 8 p.m. on November 30th and 6:30 a.m. on December 1st, the man died. The discovery. When the two horseback riders found the body at dawn, they immediately recognized that something was wrong. The man's position was too composed, too arranged. His face was too peaceful, and he'd been lying there all night in the open, apparently undisturbed. The police arrived quickly. They photographed the scene. They searched the immediate area for evidence. They examined the body where it lay, and they found very little. The sand around the body was undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no footprints suggesting anyone else had been present. No blood, no weapons, no obvious injuries. In the man's pockets they discovered an unused railway ticket from Adelaide to Henley Beach, dated for that day, a used bus ticket from the city to St. Leonard's, a nearby suburb, an American-made aluminum comb, unusual in Australia at the time, a packet of juicy fruit chewing gum, also more common in America, a packet of Army Club cigarettes, but the cigarettes inside were actually Kensitas brand, a more expensive type, a box of Bryant May matches, a white handkerchief. That was it. No wallet, no identification, no money, no keys, no letters, nothing with a name on it. The clothing was expensive and well maintained, but every single label had been removed. The suit, the shirt, the tie, the shoes. Someone had carefully cut out the manufacturer's tags from each item. The shirt still had a laundry mark indicating it had been professionally cleaned, but that led nowhere. It was as if someone had taken deliberate steps to ensure the body could not be identified. The body was transported to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, where it was officially declared dead at 7:45 a.m. The estimated time of death, based on body temperature and rigor mortis, was around 2:00 a.m., roughly 6 to 8 hours after the last confirmed sighting. An autopsy was scheduled immediately. The autopsy, Dr. John Bennett Dwyer, performed the post-mortem examination on December 1st and 2nd. What he found would only deepen the mystery. Physical characteristics. The man appeared to be between 40 and 45 years old. He stood approximately 5 feet 11 inches tall, 180 centimeters, and weighed about 175 pounds, 79 kilograms. He had a well-developed athletic build. Particularly notable were his calf muscles, which were unusually developed high on the legs, suggesting either extensive walking or possibly dance training. His hands were clean with no calluses. His fingernails were well maintained. These were not the hands of a manual laborer. He had grey-blue eyes. His hair was ginger brown, turning grey. He was clean-shaven with no scars or distinctive marks beyond natural features. His teeth were in unusually good condition for a man of his age in 1948. He had all his natural teeth with no fillings or dental work visible. This alone was remarkable enough that pathologists made special note of it. One distinctive feature stood out. His upper canine teeth were positioned immediately adjacent to his central incisors, rather than having lateral incisors between them. This dental anomaly occurs in less than 2% of the population. It would become significant later. Internal findings. This is where things became truly strange. The man's stomach contained a partially digested pasty, a meat pie of the sort sold at any number of shops around Adelaide. He'd eaten it recently, probably within 3 to 4 hours of death. This suggested he'd been in the city that evening, had purchased food, and had made his way to the beach afterward. But it was the condition of his organs that troubled the pathologists. His spleen was enormously enlarged, about 3 times normal size. His liver showed signs of congestion. There was blood in his stomach, a condition typically associated with poisoning. The blood vessels in various organs showed unusual dilatation. The post-mortem lividity, The pooling of blood that occurs after death was concentrated at the back of his neck and shoulders, suggesting he died lying in a different position than the one in which he was found. Someone, it seemed, had moved the body after death. All of these symptoms pointed toward one conclusion: the man had been poisoned. But with what? Dr. Dwyer ran every toxicology test available in 1948. He tested for barbiturates, for digitalis, for strychnine, for arsenic, for every common and uncommon poison known to medical science at that time. Every test came back negative. Whatever killed the Somerton man left no chemical trace. It was either a poison so rare or so new that 1948 testing couldn't detect it, or it was a substance that metabolized completely, leaving no residue. Dr. Dwyer's official conclusion was stark. I am quite convinced the death could not have been natural. The poison I suggested was a barbiturate or a soluble hypnotic. But he couldn't prove it. He couldn't identify the substance. He couldn't definitively state it was murder, though everything about the case suggested it. The official cause of death was listed as unknown. The investigation begins. With no identification and no clear cause of death, the police launched a missing persons investigation. They took the man's fingerprints and sent them to police forces across Australia and internationally, including to the FBI in the United States. No matches were found. Whoever this man was, he'd never been fingerprinted before, never arrested, never served in the military in any capacity that required prints, never worked in any job that required them. They circulated photographs of the body and a physical description to newspapers across Australia. Surely someone somewhere would recognize him, a family member, a co-worker, a friend, but nobody came forward. The police were baffled. This was a man who'd clearly been alive until very recently. He had to have lived somewhere. He had to have known people. He had to have had a life. How could someone simply not exist in any records, not be missed by anyone, not be claimed by any soul who'd known him? They tried another approach. Maybe someone could identify his clothing even without labels. They brought in tailors and clothiers to examine the suit and shoes. The jacket, they determined, was American-made, based on the machine stitching and construction methods. The tie was striped in the American style. British and Australian ties have stripes running in the opposite direction. Several other items suggested American origin, or at least American styling. Perhaps he was an American visitor? But again, inquiries led nowhere. No Americans had been reported missing. No ship's passenger lists showed anyone matching his description who'd arrived recently and not departed. It was as if the man had materialized on that beach fully formed, with no past, no connections, no history. By December 10th, with no identification forthcoming and the body beginning to decompose despite refrigeration, the police made a decision that would prove crucial to the investigation decades later. They had the body embalmed and a plaster cast made of the head and upper torso. This was unprecedented. The police were essentially creating a three-dimensional record of an unidentified body, preserving every detail of his features in case someone someday could identify him. 3 hairs from his head became embedded in the plaster during the casting process. No one thought much of it at the time. 70 years later, those 3 hairs would finally reveal his name. But in December 1948, all the police knew was that they had an impossible case. A well-dressed man had died on a public beach under suspicious circumstances, and absolutely no one knew who he was. The initial inquest was held on December the 17th, 1948. The coroner, Thomas Erskine Cleland, reviewed all the evidence and reached a frustrating conclusion. Cause of death unknown, identity unknown, manner of death undetermined. The body was buried in June 1949 in West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. The plot was specially chosen in a dry area of the cemetery, with the casket sealed in concrete to facilitate potential future exhumation if needed. The gravestone read simply, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach, the 1st of December, 1948. The case, it seemed, had reached a dead end. And then, 4 months after burial, a pathologist named John Cleland decided to re-examine the dead man's clothing one more time. What he found would transform this mystery into legend. Part 2. Tamám Shud, May 1949. John Cleland was meticulous. As the pathologist at the University of Adelaide and one of the doctors who'd examined the Somerton man's body, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. On a hunch, he requested the dead man's clothing from police storage. He examined every item again, checking seams, pockets, linings, anywhere something small might be hidden. And there, in a tiny fob pocket sewn into the waistband of the man's trousers, a pocket so small and so cleverly concealed that it had escaped the initial search, Cleland found a tightly rolled scrap of paper. He carefully unrolled it. Printed on the paper in an ornate typeface that suggested it came from a book were 2 words, Tamám Shud. Cleland showed the paper to Frank Kennedy, the police reporter for the Adelaide Advertiser. Kennedy had a background in languages and recognized the words as Persian. He telephoned police headquarters and suggested they obtain a copy of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The Rubaiyat, a collection of 4-line verses attributed to the 11th to 12th century Persian poet, mathematician and astronomer Omar Khayyam, had become immensely popular in the English-speaking world after Fitzgerald's 1859 translation. The verses meditated on the fleeting nature of life, the certainty of death, and the importance of living fully in the present moment. Tamám Shud, or Tamám Shud, in some transliterations, appeared as the final words in most English editions of the Rubaiyat. They meant, "It is ended," or "It is finished," a fitting conclusion to a book about mortality. The police immediately launched a public appeal. Did anyone have a copy of the Rubaiyat with its final page torn out? Days passed, then weeks, then months. The appeal yielded numerous copies of the book. The Rubaiyat was common enough that many Adelaide residents owned copies, but none with damage matching the torn page. By July 1949, The police were beginning to lose hope. And then, on July 23rd, a man walked into the Adelaide detective office with a book and a story. The book in the car. The man's identity was kept confidential. Newspapers referred to him only as Ronald Francis, a pseudonym. He lived in Glenelg, a suburb immediately adjacent to Somerton Beach. His story was simple but strange. In early December 1948, shortly after the discovery of the Somerton man's body, but before the Tamám Shud scrap had been found, Francis had gone for a drive with his brother-in-law. They'd been driving Francis's car, which he usually kept parked near Somerton Beach, often unlocked. When the brother-in-law got into the back seat, he noticed a book lying on the floor near the rear seats. He asked Francis if it was his. Francis said no. The brother-in-law assumed Francis must have forgotten it was there and didn't think about it again. Months later, after seeing the police appeal about the missing Rubaiyat, Francis remembered the book. He went to his car and retrieved it from where it had been lying undisturbed for months. It was a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and its final page had been torn out. The book's secrets. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean examined the book carefully. He confirmed that the torn edge matched the scrap of paper found in the Somerton man's pocket. This was, without question, the book that paper had come from. But the book revealed far more than anyone expected. First, it was a specific edition, a small, rare printing that had been published in New Zealand in the early 1940s. The police were able to track down other copies and confirm that the typeface and paper matched exactly. Second, and far more significantly, there was writing on the back cover. When Liana angled the book under a light, he could see indentations pressed into the paper, the remnants of handwriting that had been made on a page that was no longer present, but which had left impressions on the cover beneath. Using oblique lighting and careful photography, the police were able to make out what had been written. A phone number, unlisted but traceable, another number, possibly a code, possibly meaningless, and 5 lines of letters. The letters appeared to be some kind of code or cipher. Some letters had been crossed out. Some had marks above or below them. The second and fourth lines were identical except for additional letters. What did it mean? Was it a code, random jottings, the first letters of a sentence or poem, a substitution cipher? Despite decades of attempts by professional cryptanalysts, amateur code breakers, and computer algorithms, no one has ever successfully deciphered this sequence in a way that produces meaningful, verifiable information. It remains to this day one of the most famous unsolved codes in history. But while the code offered only frustration, the phone number offered something more concrete, a lead. The police traced the unlisted number to a house in Glenelg, just a few streets away from Somerton Beach. The house belonged to a woman who would become the most enigmatic figure in the entire case. Her name, or at least the name the police learned, was Jessica Thompson. Part 3. Jestin, July 1949. Jessica Ellen Thompson was 27 years old in 1949, though she'd tell the police she was married and had been for some time. In truth, her relationship status was complicated. She was living with a man named Prosper Thompson, a car salesman, and they had an infant son named Robin, but they wouldn't officially marry until 1950. These details would only emerge later. What mattered in July 1949 was that Jessica Thompson's phone number was written in a book connected to a dead man, and the police needed to know why. Thompson was a nurse, or had been. She'd trained in Sydney during World War II, working in military hospitals and meeting many servicemen who passed through on their way to or from the Pacific Theatre. When Detective Sergeant Lean and his colleagues knocked on her door, Thompson was polite but clearly anxious. She agreed to cooperate with the investigation on one condition. Her name must be kept out of the newspapers. The police agreed, and for the next 64 years Thompson would be known publicly only by the pseudonym Justin or Teresa Johnson Powell. The interview did not go well. Thompson admitted that she owned a copy of the Rubaiyat. In fact, she was quite familiar with the book. In 1945, while working as a nurse in Sydney, she'd met an army lieutenant named Alfred Boxall at the Clifton Gardens Hotel. They'd had a brief romance, or at least a brief acquaintance charged with romantic possibility. Before Boxall shipped out for deployment, Thompson had given him a copy of the Rubaiyat as a keepsake. She'd signed it with the nickname Justin, with an inexplicable capital E in the middle, and had transcribed one of the verses onto the inside cover. Indeed, repentance oft before I swore, but was I sober when I swore? And then came spring and rose in hand, my threadbare penitence a pieces tore. It was verse 70, a meditation on regret, on promises broken, on the way life and passion tear through our best intentions. The police felt certain they'd solved the case. The dead man was Alfred Boxall. It had to be. They tracked Boxall down in Sydney, where he was working at the Randwick bus depot, completely unaware that anyone was looking for him or that his name had been connected to any mystery. And when they examined the copy of the Rubaiyat that Thompson had given him 4 years earlier, it was intact. The final page was still there, complete with Tamám Shud printed at the end. This was not the book found in the car. Boxall was not the Somerton man. So the police returned to Thompson with follow-up questions, and this time they brought something with them: the plaster cast of the dead man's face. The reaction. What happened next was witnessed by multiple police officers and would be discussed and analyzed for decades. When Thompson was shown the plaster cast, the three-dimensional replica of the dead man's features, she went pale. According to the officers present, she appeared completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. She steadied herself. She looked at the cast again, and then she said, clearly and definitively, "I do not know this man." But her reaction suggested otherwise. Something about that face had shocked her, had shaken her in a way that seemed to go far beyond mere surprise. The police pressed her. "Are you certain you've never seen him before? Could he have been a patient, a friend of a friend, someone from your time in Sydney?" Thompson was evasive. her answers vague and contradictory. Yes, she knew the Rubaiyat. Yes, she'd given a copy to a man she knew during the war. No, she didn't know who the Somerton man was. No, she couldn't explain why her phone number was in his book. Had anyone unusual contacted her recently? Asked for her by name? Now Thompson hesitated. Yes, actually, sometime in 1948, she couldn't remember exactly when, possibly spring or early summer, a man had come to her house asking for her. She'd been out at the time. Her neighbor told her about it later. A well-dressed man, polite, asking if this was where Jessica Thompson lived. When told she wasn't home, he'd thanked the neighbor and left. He never returned. Could that man have been the Somerton man? Thompson didn't know. She'd never seen him. She had no idea who he was or what he wanted. The police asked if they could search her house. Thompson agreed. They found nothing connected to the case. No second copy of the Rubaiyat. No correspondence. No evidence of any connection to the dead man. But Detective Sergeant Lean would later write in his notes that he was convinced Thompson knew more than she was saying. Her reaction to the plaster cast, her evasive answers, her nervous demeanor, all of it suggested she was hiding something. Whatever she knew, she wasn't telling, and she never would. Jessica Thompson died in 2007, taking her secrets to the grave. Questions without answers. The discovery of the book and the connection to Thompson raised more questions than it answered. If the Somerton man had Thompson's phone number, he obviously knew who she was. But how and why? Had they met during the war years when Thompson was nursing in Sydney? The Somerton man's estimated age, 40-45, would make him slightly older than the typical serviceman, but not impossibly so. Had he been a patient, an officer she'd met socially? Or had they known each other more recently? Thompson had moved to Adelaide in 1947 when Prosper Thompson's work brought them there. Had the Somerton man followed her? Was he obsessed with her? Was there a romantic connection? And what about the code in the back of the book? If the Somerton man had written it, which seemed likely, what did it mean? Was it a message to Thompson? Instructions for meeting? A cipher related to espionage? Because by 1949, with the Cold War intensifying and spy paranoia reaching fever pitch, many investigators were starting to wonder, was the Somerton man a spy? Part 4. The Spy Theory. 1949 to 1950. The Cold War intensifies. To understand why espionage became a leading theory, we need to understand the context of 1948 to 1949 Australia. World War II had ended only 3 years earlier. The world was rapidly dividing into two camps. The Western Allies, led by the United States and United Kingdom, and the Soviet bloc, led by the USSR. The phrase Cold War had been coined in 1947. Tensions were high, paranoia was higher. Australia, despite its geographic isolation, was deeply involved in this new conflict. The country hosted several highly sensitive military and research installations. Woomera, a top-secret British rocket testing range in the South Australian outback, 300 miles north of Adelaide, naval intelligence facilities in multiple locations, research into nuclear weapons and rocketry. Both the UK and US intelligence services suspected Soviet agents were operating in Australia, attempting to gather information about these installations. And Adelaide, as a major port city close to Woomera, would have been a logical base of operations for any spy ring. So, when a man died mysteriously with all identifying marks removed from his clothing, carrying a cryptic coded message near sensitive military facilities, espionage seemed plausible. Let's examine the evidence that supported the spy theory. Evidence 4. 1. The systematic removal of identification. Every label had been cut from the Somerton man's clothing. This wasn't casual, it was methodical. Someone didn't want this body identified. In espionage, this is called sanitizing a body. If an agent is killed or dies on a mission, their handlers will remove anything that could lead back to their real identity or their intelligence organization. 2. The undetectable poison. Whatever killed the Somerton man left no trace. In 1948, Soviet intelligence agencies were known to have access to exotic poisons that could kill without leaving evidence. The KGB's poison laboratory had been developing such substances since the 1920s. The symptoms: blood in the stomach, enlarged spleen, organ congestion, were consistent with certain barbiturates or cardiac glycosides, but in forms that wouldn't show up on standard toxicology tests. 3. The coded message. The 5 lines of letters in the Rubaiyat looked exactly like the kind of cipher that intelligence agencies used. They could represent a one-time pad code, unbreakable without the key, initial letters of a longer message, a book cipher using a specific edition of a text, instructions for a dead drop or meeting. Professional cryptanalysts who examined the code couldn't break it, but they also couldn't rule out that it was a genuine cipher. 4. The American items. The Somerton man carried several items that suggested American connections. Wrigley's gum, uncommon in Australia; an aluminum comb, rare in Australia, common among US military personnel; American-made clothing. During the late 1940s, American intelligence agencies were actively working in Australia, particularly around Woomera. Could the Somerton man have been an American agent, or an agent trying to pass as American? 5. The location. Somerton Beach is just a few miles from Adelaide's port and naval facilities. It would have been a plausible location for a clandestine meeting, public enough to avoid suspicion, quiet enough for privacy late at night. 6. Jessica Thompson's possible connections. Some investigators suspected Thompson herself might have been involved in intelligence work. Her daughter would later claim that Thompson had admitted to being fluent in Russian, an unusual skill for an Australian nurse in the 1940s, and one she'd never explained. Thompson's evasiveness during police questioning, her shocked reaction to seeing the Somerton man's face, her refusal to provide straight answers, all of this could suggest she knew more than she was saying. Had she been a Soviet agent, an Allied agent, a courier? 7. Alf Boxall's military career. Alfred Boxall, the man Thompson had given her original rubaiyat to, had a curious military record. He'd been promoted from lance corporal to lieutenant in just 3 months, a promotion rate that normally took years. When interviewed decades later, Boxall would confirm that he'd worked in intelligence during the war, though he insisted he had no knowledge of any espionage connection to the Somerton man case. 8. The timing. November-December 1948 was a period of heightened Cold War tension. The Berlin blockade was underway. Intelligence agencies on both sides were aggressively recruiting agents and conducting operations worldwide. Evidence against. But for every piece of evidence supporting the spy theory, there was counter-evidence suggesting it might be completely wrong. 1. Too many mistakes. If the Somerton man was a professional agent, he made numerous errors that would be unthinkable for someone with intelligence training. He was seen by multiple witnesses before his death. He left his body in a highly visible public location. He carried items connecting him to another person, Jessica Thompson. He left a coded message that, if it was genuinely important, should have been destroyed. He failed to complete whatever mission brought him to Adelaide. Professional spies don't die on public beaches. 2. The amateur code. Professional cryptanalysts who examined the letter sequence were skeptical it was a real cipher. The pattern seemed too random, too inconsistent. Real intelligence codes from the 1940s followed specific patterns. This didn't match any known system. It might have been personal notes, gibberish, or an amateur attempt at creating a code. 3. No intelligence service claimed him. After the case received international publicity, no intelligence agency, not British MI6, not American CIA or OSS, not Soviet KGB, ever indicated the Somerton man was one of their operatives. While agencies don't usually acknowledge their agents, they also don't let mystery deaths go completely unexplained if they might compromise operations. The silence was telling. 4. The romantic elements. The connection to Jessica Thompson, the gift of the rubaiyat with its romantic poetry, the possible unrequited love. All of this seemed more consistent with a personal drama than an intelligence operation. Spies don't carry love tokens to their deaths. 5. The physical evidence. While the removed clothing labels and undetectable poison seemed sophisticated, other aspects of the case didn't match espionage. No secret documents, no dead drops arranged, no safe houses identified, no contact with known intelligence networks, no suspicious activity before or after his death. The spy theory remained popular for decades, fueled by Cold War paranoia and the genuinely mysterious circumstances of the death. But as time passed and more evidence emerged, or rather failed to emerge, many investigators began to favor a different explanation. Perhaps the Somerton man wasn't a spy at all. Perhaps he was simply a man in love with a woman who didn't love him back. Part 5. The Suitcase, January 14th, 1949. 6 weeks after the body was discovered, railway staff at Adelaide station were performing routine checks when they found an unclaimed suitcase in the luggage storage room. The brown suitcase had been deposited on November 30th, 1948, the day before the Somerton man's body was found. The claimed ticket had never been collected. Given the timing and location, police suspected it might belong to the dead man. They collected it and examined the contents. What they found only deepened the mystery. The suitcase contained a reel of orange thread matching the thread used to repair the tear in the dead man's pocket, a screwdriver modified to be finer than normal for precision work, scissors, a stenciling brush, a knife, a table knife that had been sharpened into a tool, several pieces of clothing, all with labels removed, a laundry bag, and most intriguingly, some of the clothing bore laundry marks or names that had been partially removed. One item was marked T. Keane, another read Keane. A third showed Keane, but examination revealed these names had been added after the original labels were removed, stitched on in a different hand, possibly to mislead investigators or create a false identity. There was also a curious item, a coat made from a very specific type of American thread that had only been available in Australia for a short time around 1947 to 1948. The suitcase confirmed several things. The man had arrived in Adelaide on November 30th by train. He deliberately removed all identifying labels. He'd carried tools suggesting he did precision work. He'd added false names to some items. He'd planned to stay somewhere. The suitcase contained enough clothing for several days, but it answered nothing about who he was or why he was there. Police checked every hotel, boarding house, and hostel in Adelaide. No one matching the Somerton man's description had checked in around November 30th. No one remembered seeing him. How does a man arrive by train, leave his suitcase at the station, spend several hours in the city? He'd eaten a pasty, purchased bus tickets, make his way to a beach and die, all without anyone remembering him or being able to identify him. Part 6. The Inquest, June 17th, 1949. 7 months after the body was discovered. With no progress on identification and the case growing cold, Coroner Thomas Erskine Cleland convened a formal inquest. The proceedings attracted significant public attention. Newspapers covered every detail. Dozens of people came to view the embalmed body, hoping to identify him. None could. The inquest heard from Dr. John Dwyer, who detailed the autopsy findings and his conviction the man had been poisoned. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, who described the investigation. John Lyons and his wife, who'd seen the man alive on the beach. Various witnesses who'd reported sightings. Jessica Thompson, testifying privately with her identity protected. The evidence was laid out methodically. Time of death, approximately 2 a.m., December 1st, 1948. Cause of death, unknown, possibly poisoning by an undetectable substance. Identity unknown, manner of death undetermined. Coroner Cleland delivered his verdict. "I am unable to say who the deceased was. I am unable to say how he died or where he died." It was one of the most unsatisfying conclusions in Australian legal history. The body had been buried a week earlier, on June 14, 1949, in West Terrace Cemetery. The plot was carefully chosen in a dry section of the cemetery. The casket was sealed in concrete to preserve the body in case exhumation became necessary. The headstone read, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach the 1st of December, 1948 inches. And there the case sat, officially unsolved, for decades." Part 7. The Code Breakers, 1949 to 2022. 70 years of attempts. The 5 lines of letters found in the Rubaiyat became an obsession for code breakers worldwide. Professional cryptanalysts, amateur sleuths, computer scientists, and curious enthusiasts have all attempted to crack this code. None have succeeded in producing a solution that convinces others or yields verifiable information. Theories about the code. Theory 1. Initial letters. Perhaps each letter represents the first letter of a word, spelling out a sentence or message. But what words, and in what language? English, Persian, Russian, German? Countless attempts to find sensible English sentences have failed. The pattern doesn't seem to match common linguistic structures. Theory 2. Substitution cipher. Maybe each letter represents a different letter, shifted or substituted according to a key. But standard cryptanalytic techniques, frequency analysis, pattern matching, known plaintext attacks have yielded nothing meaningful. Theory 3. Book cipher. Perhaps the letters reference specific pages, lines, and words in a particular book, possibly a specific edition of the Rubaiyat itself. But which edition? And how would the reference system work? Despite extensive testing, no one has found a book that yields sensible results. Theory 4. Phone numbers or coordinates. Some have suggested the letters might represent numbers when translated through various systems. But again, no convincing results have emerged. Theory 5. It's not a code. This is the theory favored by many modern investigators. The letters aren't a code at all. They might be random jottings, abbreviations for personal notes, initial letters of names people the man knew or wanted to contact, racing tips, horse names, an unfinished draft of something, meaningless scribbles. If they're not a code, that explains why no one can crack them. There's nothing to crack. The crossed out line. One detail that intrigues analysts. The second line, MLIAOY, appears again as the fourth line, but with additional letters. And in the original, the second line has been crossed out, not erased, but deliberately struck through. This suggests someone wrote MLIOI, then realized it was wrong or incomplete, crossed it out, and later wrote it again with corrections. This pattern is consistent with someone drafting notes or messages, not with a formal cipher. Despite 70 years of effort, the code, if it is a code, remains unbroken. It stands as one of the world's most famous unsolved ciphers, alongside the Voynich manuscript and the Zodiac Killer's 340-character message, which was finally cracked in 2020. But unlike those codes, which show clear structure and intentionality, the Somerton man's letters might be nothing more than a red herring, a mystery where there is no mystery, a code that encodes nothing. Part 8. The Genetic Mystery, 2000s to 2021, The Hunt for DNA. As DNA technology advanced in the late 20th century, investigators began to wonder, could modern forensics finally identify the Somerton man? The body had been embalmed and buried for decades. Embalming destroys most DNA, but there was one potential source, the plaster death mask created in 1948, which had captured 3 of the man's hairs during the casting process. Professor Derek Abbott, a biomedical engineer at the University of Adelaide, became fascinated with the case in the early 2000s. What began as casual interest evolved into obsession. Abbott noticed something remarkable. Photographs of Jessica Thompson's son Robin, born in 1947, showed unusual physical features that matched the Somerton man. The ear anomaly. Both Robin and the Somerton man had an extremely rare ear shape. The Simba upper hollow was larger than the cavum lower hollow, a feature found in only 1 to 2% of the population. The dental anomaly. Both had hypodontia, missing lateral incisors, with the canine teeth positioned directly next to the central incisors. This genetic condition appears in only 2% of the population. The calf muscles. Both had unusually high, pronounced calf muscles of the type seen in dancers or people who regularly wore high-heeled shoes. The probability of 3 separate rare genetic features appearing in 2 unrelated individuals was astronomically low. Abbott formed a controversial hypothesis. Robin Thompson was the Somerton man's son. Jessica Thompson had had an affair with the Somerton man, or a relationship before her marriage, and Robin was the result. When the Somerton man came to Adelaide in 1948, he was looking for Jessica, perhaps to reconnect, perhaps to see his son, perhaps to convince her to leave with him. It was a romantic theory, and if true, it would explain Jessica's shocked reaction to seeing the plaster cast, her evasiveness with police, her insistence that her name be kept secret. But it was just a theory. Abbott needed proof. The DNA quest. In 2009, Abbott approached South Australian authorities about exhuming the body to extract DNA. The request was denied. Exhumation is expensive, disruptive, and legally complex. But Abbott didn't give up. He knew about those 3 hairs embedded in the plaster death mask, preserved in the South Australian Museum's collection. In 2011, he was granted permission to examine the death mask. Using microscopic analysis, he confirmed the hairs were indeed embedded in the plaster. Extracting them without destroying the historical artifact took years of careful planning and negotiation. Finally, in the late 2010s, Abbott partnered with DNA Doe Project, an American organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify unknown persons. They also brought in Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist who'd helped solve numerous cold cases. The process was painstaking. Extract DNA from the hairs, complicated by age and embalming chemicals. Sequence the degraded DNA. Upload results to genealogy databases. Build a family tree working backward from genetic matches. Identify the Somerton man's relatives. Trace the family tree forward to identify him. This technique, genetic genealogy, had recently been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, revolutionizing cold case investigation. May 2021, the exhumation. After years of legal petitions, South Australian Attorney General Vicky Chapman finally authorized exhumation of the body in May 2021. On May 19th, forensic teams carefully removed the concrete vault and extracted the coffin. Despite 72 years in the ground, the embalming had partially preserved the remains. Tissue samples and bone fragments were collected for DNA analysis. The skeletal remains were photographed and measured. Then the body was reburied with respect. Abbott and his team processed the DNA samples, uploaded the results to genealogy databases, and began the painstaking work of building family trees. And in July 2022, 74 years after the man died on Somerton Beach, they announced they'd identified him. Part 9. Carl Webb. July 26, 2022. Professor Derek Abbott held a press conference that made international headlines. We have identified the Somerton man as Carl Charles Webb. According to Abbott's research, full name, Carl Charles Webb. Born November 16, 1905, in Footscray, Melbourne, Victoria. Died December 1st, 1948, Somerton Beach, Adelaide, age 43. Occupation: electrical engineer and instrument maker. Known family: married Dorothy Doff Robertson in 1941. Separated in April 1947. Webb was born into a working-class Melbourne family. His father, Richard August Webb, was German-Australian. His mother was of Irish descent. Carl was intelligent, technically skilled, and worked as an electrical engineer, the kind of precision work suggested by the modified tools found in his suitcase. In 1941, he married Dorothy Robertson. The marriage was troubled. By April 1947, Dorothy filed for divorce, claiming Carl had disappeared and abandoned her. The divorce was finalized by 1951. Sometime after the separation, Carl Webb left Melbourne. His whereabouts between April 1947 and November 1948 are unknown. By November 30th, 1948, he was in Adelaide, arriving by train, checking his suitcase at the station, and making his way to Somerton Beach, where he died. The evidence, Abbott's identification, was based on genetic genealogy, matching Carl Webb's DNA profile to distant relatives in genealogy databases. The family tree was constructed by tracing relationships through multiple generations, eventually converging on Carl Webb as the only possible match. Additional circumstantial evidence supported the identification. Webb's age, 43, matched the estimated age of the Somerton man, 45. Webb was the right height and build. Webb was an engineer consistent with the precision tools in the suitcase. Webb had disappeared from Melbourne with no trace. No death certificate, no subsequent records. But here's where things get complicated. South Australian police did not officially confirm the identification. In their statement they said, "Although this remains a very complex investigation and the evidence gathered to date is extensive, for the purposes of finalizing the coronial report and for the benefit of the next of kin, it remains important that we are able to verify the identity of the Somerton man through traditional police methodology." In other words, Abbott's genetic genealogy analysis might be correct, but it hadn't been independently verified through official channels and therefore couldn't be legally confirmed. As of 2024, the case remains technically open, with Carl Webb as the leading candidate for identification, but not officially confirmed by authorities. The problems with the Webb identification. While Abbott's work was groundbreaking, several issues complicate the neat resolution. 1. No direct DNA match. The identification was based on matching distant genetic relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, and building family trees backward. While this technique has been successful in other cases, it relies on accurate genealogical records which have gaps, correct interpretation of DNA matching, no unknown adoptions or family secrets, proper statistical analysis of probability. Some geneticists have questioned whether the confidence level is high enough for definitive identification. 2. No explanation for the mystery. Even if Carl Webb is the Somerton man, we still don't know why he removed all clothing labels, what the code in the Rubaiyat meant, if anything, how he died, why he was on Somerton Beach, what his connection to Jessica Thompson was, if any, why he came to Adelaide. The identification answers who, but none of the other questions. 3. The Jessica Thompson connection. If Webb is the Somerton man, how does Jessica Thompson fit in? Abbott initially theorized that Webb was Robin Thompson's biological father, which would explain everything. But if the DNA analysis is correct and Webb is the Somerton man, then Robin couldn't have been Webb's son. The genetic markers don't match. So either Abbott's identification is wrong, or Thompson had no connection to the Somerton man beyond coincidence, or the relationship was different than theorized. 4. Dorothy Webb's later life. After divorcing Carl Webb, Dorothy remarried and lived until 1995 in Butte, South Australia, just 90 miles from Adelaide. Some have speculated Carl came to Adelaide looking for Dorothy, hoping to reconcile, but there's no evidence they had contact after 1947, and Dorothy never indicated she knew anything about the Somerton man case. 5. The dental records. Carl Webb's dental records from Melbourne, if they still exist, have never been officially compared to the Somerton man's dental chart from the autopsy. This would be the traditional gold standard for identification, but apparently those records either weren't preserved or haven't been located. So where does this leave us? Carl Webb is probably the Somerton man. The genetic evidence is strong, even if not definitive. The circumstantial details fit, the timeline works. But probably isn't the same as certainly. And even if we're 99% sure about the identity, we're still 0% sure about everything else that matters. How did Carl Webb die? Why did he die? What brought him to Adelaide? What was he doing on Somerton Beach? Those questions remain as mysterious as they were in 1948. Part 10. Theories Revisited. With Carl Webb as our probable identification, let's reconsider the major theories. The spy theory, unlikely. Carl Webb was an electrical engineer from Melbourne, not a trained intelligence agent. There's no evidence he had connections to any intelligence service. His background is too ordinary, too traceable. The spy theory, romantic as it was, doesn't fit. The poisoning, still mysterious. Webb died of something that looked like poisoning but left no trace. In 1948, that suggested exotic substances available only to intelligence agencies. But there are other possibilities. An allergic reaction to something in the pasty he ate, a rare medical condition that mimicked poisoning, digitalis or other plant-based toxins that degraded before testing, a suicide using a substance he had access to as an engineer. The autopsy findings, enlarged spleen, blood in stomach, organ congestion, could indicate various medical emergencies, not necessarily poison. The Jessica Thompson connection, probably coincidence. If Webb wasn't Robin's father, and the DNA suggests he wasn't, then what was his connection to Jessica Thompson? Possibly none. The phone number in the Rubaiyat might have been wrong, meant for someone else with a similar number, written by someone other than Webb. An old number Webb had from another context, random chance. Thompson's shocked reaction to the plaster cast might have been genuine surprise at the resemblance to someone she knew, not Webb. A normal reaction to seeing a death mask of any stranger. Concern that the case might reveal something embarrassing from her past, unrelated to Webb. Without confirmation of a direct connection, Occam's razor suggests Thompson was a red herring. The suicide theory possible. Consider this scenario. Carl Webb's life fell apart in 1947 when his marriage ended. Depressed, perhaps drinking heavily, he drifted for over a year. By November 1948, he was at rock bottom. He traveled to Adelaide. Why Adelaide specifically? Maybe he had friends or relatives there, or maybe it was random. He brought only a small suitcase. He removed all identifying labels from his clothes and added false names. Not because he was a spy, but because he planned to kill himself and didn't want his estranged family to be burdened with the shame and expense of dealing with his death. He ate a final meal, the pasty. He walked to the beach, found a quiet spot, and took a fatal dose of something. Perhaps a substance he'd synthesized as an engineer, perhaps a common poison that degraded quickly. He lay back against the seawall, crossed his feet, put an unlit cigarette behind his ear, a habitual gesture, and waited to die. The code in the Rubaiyat wasn't a code at all. just random notes, abbreviations, or the first letters of thoughts he wanted to remember. The Tamám Shud paper was a poetic flourish. It is finished, a final statement about his life. This theory fits most of the evidence and requires no exotic poisons, no intelligence conspiracies, no mysterious lovers. Just a sad, lonely man who wanted to disappear completely. The accident, natural death theory, less likely. Some have proposed Webb had an undiagnosed medical condition, possibly related to his enlarged spleen, and simply died of natural causes that happened to produce symptoms resembling poisoning. But this doesn't explain the removed labels, the hidden Tamám Shud paper, or the apparent premeditation suggested by his actions. Part 11. The unanswered questions. Even with a name attached to the body, the Somerton Man case leaves us with profound mysteries. 1. Why did Carl Webb remove all identifying labels from his clothing? This is the action of someone who specifically doesn't want to be identified. Suicide seems the most plausible motive, but we can't be certain. 2. What is the meaning of the 5 lines of letters? If they're a code, no one has cracked it. If they're not a code, what are they? Personal notes? Racing tips? Gibberish? We may never know. 3. How did Carl Webb die? The autopsy revealed symptoms consistent with poisoning, but no poison was detected. Modern toxicology might identify substances that 1948 testing missed, but the body has been buried for decades, and any chemical traces would be long degraded. 4. What was Carl Webb's connection to Jessica Thompson, if any? Her phone number was in the book. She reacted strangely to his death mask. But if Webb wasn't Robin's father, what was their relationship? Did they even know each other? 5. Why Somerton Beach? Why did Webb choose that specific location to die? Was it random or did it have significance? 6. Who threw the rubaiyat into Ronald Francis's car? Francis claimed the book simply appeared in his car near Somerton Beach. Who put it there? Webb himself? An accomplice? A passerby who found it? And when exactly? 7. Who was the man seen watching Webb from the top of the steps? A witness reported someone standing at the top of the beach stairs looking down at the sleeping, dying man. Who was that? A concerned citizen? Someone involved? A figment of misremembered testimony? 8. What happened to Carl Webb between April 1947 and November 1948? 18 months are completely unaccounted for. Where was he? What was he doing? How did he get from Melbourne to Adelaide? These questions may never be answered. Time has erased too much evidence. The people who knew Webb, his ex-wife, his family, his colleagues, are long dead. We have a name, but names are just the beginning of identity. The real Carl Webb, his thoughts, his motives, his final days, remains as mysterious as the unnamed body that lay on Somerton Beach for 74 years. Part 12. Epilogue. The Enduring Mystery. 2024. 76 years later, Somerton Beach looks much the same today as it did in 1948. The seawall is still there, though reinforced and renovated. The crippled children's home is long gone, replaced by modern apartments. But the sand, the ocean, the twilight atmosphere, those remain unchanged. People still walk that beach at sunset, and some pause at the spot where the Somerton man was found, wondering about the mystery that unfolded here. The case has entered Australian folklore. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, podcasts, academic papers, and countless online discussions. The Tamám Shud Case has become synonymous with unsolvable mystery, with the kind of question that has no answer. Even with Carl Webb's name attached to the case, the essential mystery persists, because identification was never really the question. The question was always, why? Why did a 43-year-old electrical engineer from Melbourne end up dead on an Adelaide beach with all identification removed, carrying a cryptic message torn from a book of Persian poetry? Why did he do it the way he did? So theatrical, so mysterious, so calculated to create exactly the kind of puzzle that would haunt investigators for generations. Was it intentional? Was Carl Webb deliberately constructing a mystery, ensuring that his death would be remembered, that his anonymity would be temporary, but his enigma eternal? Or was it all coincidence, a series of odd but explicable choices that happened to align in a way that seemed mysterious but was actually mundane? We can't know. Carl Webb took his secrets with him. The death mask, the plaster cast of the Somerton man's face still exists, preserved in storage by South Australian authorities. It's rarely displayed, too macabre, too unsettling. But photographs of it circulate online, and those who see it are struck by the same thing witnesses in 1949 noted: the expression, "The Somerton man, Carl Webb, looks peaceful. His eyes are closed. His face is relaxed. There's no grimace of pain, no evidence of suffering. He looks like a man who lay down to sleep and simply didn't wake up, or like a man who lay down to die and accepted it with complete serenity." Those who believe in the suicide theory see confirmation in that expression. Those who favor other theories see a man caught off guard by death, with no time to react. The face reveals nothing. It's just a face frozen in plaster, preserving features that no longer mean what they once did. Carl Webb is dead. The mystery remains alive. The grave. In West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide, the grave marker has been updated, where it once read, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach the 1st of December 1948. It now includes the name Carl Charles Webb, 1905 to 1948. It's a small change, a name where there was none. But it changes nothing about what happened on that beach 76 years ago. It changes nothing about the questions that still hover over this case like the morning fog that rolls in from the ocean. Some mysteries are meant to be solved. Others are meant to remind us that even in an age of DNA and databases and digital surveillance, there are still places in the human experience where darkness persists, where questions outnumber answers, where the truth remains tantalizingly out of reach. The Somerton man is one of those mysteries. We know his name now. Perhaps that's enough. Or perhaps, as the Persian poet Omar Khayyam understood, knowing names is never enough. Carl Webb's line has been written. His story is finished. Tamám Shud. If you've listened this far, you've journeyed through one of the strangest mysteries in modern history. You've heard about a man found dead on a beach, carrying a message that means it is ended. You've learned about poison without trace, codes without meaning, connections without explanation, and now you know his name. But knowing his name doesn't mean you know him. Carl Webb remains, in essential ways, as unknown as he was when John Lyons saw him lying against the seawall, raising his arm in that peculiar gesture before letting it fall back to the sand. What was Carl Webb thinking in his final hours? What brought him to that beach? What drove him to such elaborate precautions against identification? What was the message he wanted to send by dying the way he did? We will never know. Some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened. Some questions, once asked, echo forever without answers. The Somerton Man case reminds us that for all our technology, for all our databases and DNA sequencing and digital forensics, there are still mysteries we cannot solve. There are still human stories that slip through the gaps in our understanding, that resist our attempts to categorize and explain them. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we need mysteries. Maybe we need to be reminded that the world is larger and stranger than we imagine, that people are more complex than we assume, that death is not always explicable and life is not always comprehensible. Carl Webb died on Somerton Beach 76 years ago, but his mystery lives on. And perhaps in some strange way, that's what he wanted all along. To be remembered, to be wondered about, to be the question that has no answer. Tamám Shud. It is finished, but it will never truly end. Sleep well, if you can.